At 11:47 p.m., the executive signed National Security Directive 14 Alpha, authorizing preemptive military strikes against the Northern Federation's coastal missile installations. The directive specified a 12-hour operational window beginning at dawn. It did not include legislative authorization. The Constitution's Article 7 vests war declaration authority exclusively in the federal legislature. At 11:58 p.m., the legislature's Defense Oversight Committee chair issued an emergency statement. No authorization for military action has been granted. Any strike without constitutional approval violates separation of powers subscribed to this channel. Now, because what you are about to witness is not a foreign policy debate. This is a constitutional war powers crisis where the executive has ordered military action and the legislature has explicitly denied authorization. This is the military receiving contradictory directives from two co-equal branches of government. And this is a 12-hour countdown to determine whether constitutional checks on executive war powers still function or whether the executive can unilaterally initiate combat operations. Turn on notifications because the next 12 hours will decide whether the strike proceeds, whether commanders obey the executive's order despite legislative denial, and whether the constitutional framework for authorizing war survives this confrontation. Here is what led to this moment. For 6 months, the Northern Federation has been conducting naval exercises near our territorial waters. Intelligence assessments indicated the Federation was deploying advanced anti-ship missile batteries to forward coastal positions. 3 weeks ago, a Federation patrol vessel fired warning shots across the bow of our reconnaissance ship. No casualties occurred. The Federation claimed our vessel had violated their exclusive economic zone. Our government rejected that claim. But here's where it shifted. 4 days ago, satellite imagery confirmed the Federation had activated 6 coastal missile sites within range of our naval assets. The Defense Ministry concluded the installations could deny access to critical maritime corridors within 72 hours. Yesterday, the executive convened the Federal Security Council. Sources report the executive stated that waiting for legislative debate would allow the Federation to complete deployment, creating strategic vulnerability. The executive's legal counsel argued that Article 7 permits defensive military action without prior legislative approval when facing imminent threats. The defense minister supported immediate action. The foreign minister opposed it, arguing no imminent attack had occurred. At 9:34 p.m. last night, the foreign minister resigned. The resignation letter stated the executive intended to order strikes without legislative authorization, and that remaining in office would make the minister complicit in a constitutional violation. The letter included a classified annexure containing Security Council communications showing the executive had directed strike preparations 3 days before consulting the legislature. Its release triggered immediate demands for an emergency legislative session. Now watch what happens next. At 10:47 p.m., the legislature's leadership convened an emergency session with 63 members present. At 11:34 p.m., they voted 52-11 on a resolution explicitly denying authorization for any military action against the Northern Federation, absent a direct attack. The resolution stated that preemptive strikes without legislative approval violate Article 7, and that any executive order authorizing such action is constitutionally void. 13 minutes later, the executive signed the strike directive anyway. At 12:03 a.m., the Joint Strategic Command received both the executive strike authorization and the legislature's denial. The command's legal staff immediately flagged the conflict. Standard doctrine requires both executive authorization and legislative approval for offensive action. Preemptive strikes occupy a constitutional gray zone. No court has ruled on whether the executive can order strikes against potential threats without legislative consent. At 12:17 a.m., the command requested clarification from the Defense Ministry. The ministry stated the executive's directive is lawful under Article 7's emergency provisions. At 12:34 a.m., the legislature's Defense Oversight Committee chair sent a formal communication to all military commanders. The legislature has denied authorization for military action. Any strikes conducted without constitutional approval are unlawful. Personnel participating in such operations may be subject to legal consequences. Commanders are reminded that their oath is to the Constitution, which vests war declaration authority in the legislature, not solely in the executive. That communication created an impossible situation for military commanders. They have an order from the executive to launch strikes at dawn. They have a legislative denial stating those strikes are unconstitutional. And they have 12 hours to decide which authority to follow. Drop a comment right now. Tell me whether the military should obey the executive strike order or comply with the legislature's denial. I am reading every response because this is the question every commander is confronting tonight. At 1:03 a.m., the defense minister held a secure conference with the Joint Strategic Command and operational commanders. Sources report the minister stated the executive's authority to direct military operations is unambiguous and that the strike authorization is legally valid. When asked about the legislature's denial, the minister reportedly said legislative approval is politically preferable but not constitutionally required for defensive actions. At 1:28 a.m., 3 senior legal advisors within the defense ministry resigned. Their joint letter stated that characterizing preemptive strikes as defensive action misrepresents constitutional war powers doctrine. The letter argued the executive is exceeding constitutional authority and that military personnel following the strike order could be executing an unlawful command. Those resignations reached legislative leaders within minutes. It's true now if you have not already, because what I'm about to show you is how enforcement authority fractures when the executive and legislature issue contradictory directives on war powers at 2:14 a.m. The Federal Reserve Bank governor issued an extraordinary statement. The Reserve has received no legislative appropriation for military operations beyond current defensive readiness levels. Funding for offensive strike operations requires explicit legislative authorization. Without such authorization, the Reserve cannot transfer operational funds to the Defense Ministry for the proposed action. That statement introduces a third institutional barrier. Even if the military decides to follow the executive's order, the central bank is refusing to fund the operation without legislative approval. 8:41 a.m., the executive's chief of staff responded, emergency operational funds are available under executive discretionary accounts. The Reserve's cooperation is not required for time-sensitive national security actions. But constitutional scholars immediately noted that using discretionary funds to circumvent legislative war powers would itself be a constitutional violation. At 3:07 a.m., the legislature's Appropriations Committee chair announced that any use of discretionary funds for unauthorized military strikes would trigger an immediate funding cutoff for all executive operations and potential impeachment proceedings. There is a detail most people missed. The Constitution's Article 7 includes 2 clauses. Clause 1 states that the legislature holds the exclusive power to declare war. Clause 2 states that the executive serves as commander of the armed forces. The framers included both clauses to create a balance. The legislature decides whether to go to war. The executive commands military operations once war is authorized. But the framers did not specify what happens when the executive orders military action and the legislature explicitly denies authorization. That gap is being tested right now. At 3:34 a.m., the Supreme Tribunal's Chief Justice was contacted by legislative leaders requesting an emergency ruling on whether the executive strike authorization is constitutional. The Chief Justice declined, stating that the tribunal does not issue advisory opinions on hypothetical actions and that any ruling would require a case with standing brought after the action occurs. That means if the strikes happen, they happen without judicial clarity on their constitutionality. Legal challenges would come after missiles are already launched. At 4:02 a.m., the Joint Strategic Command held an internal consultation with all flag officers involved in the strike planning. According to sources, the discussion centered on the commander's constitutional obligations. Some officers argued that the executive's order is lawful and must be followed. Others argued that launching strikes explicitly denied by the legislature would violate their oath to the Constitution. The meeting concluded without consensus. At 4:29 a.m., the command issued an internal directive. All personnel are reminded that lawful orders must be obeyed and that unlawful orders must be refused. The determination of whether an order is lawful rests with each commander's judgment under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. That directive essentially placed the decision on individual commanders rather than providing institutional guidance. This is the moment it stopped being a constitutional debate and became an operational crisis. At 5:03 a.m., the Naval Operations Commander notified the Joint Strategic Command that the strike group is positioned and ready, but that proceeding without legislative authorization poses unacceptable constitutional and legal risks. The commander requested written confirmation that the operation is lawful. At 5:17 a.m., the defense minister provided that confirmation, stating that the executive's authority as commander of the armed forces is sufficient, and that legislative micromanagement of operational decisions is unconstitutional. At 5:34 a.m., the Airstrike Coordination Center reported that 4 of 7 wing commanders have expressed reservations about participating in the operation without legislative approval. At 5:48 a.m., the legislature's Defense Oversight Committee announced that any military personnel who execute strikes without legislative authorization will be called to testify before the committee and may face charges under military law for violating constitutional limits on executive power. At 6:11 a.m., Allied governments were briefed on the pending operation. 3 Allied defense ministries reportedly expressed concern that strikes without legislative authorization could complicate coalition security arrangements and mutual defense commitments. At 6:29 a.m., one Allied government publicly called for restraint and urged resolution through constitutional processes before military action. Here are the indicators we are watching as the operational window approaches. Does the executive withdraw the authorization? Does the Joint Strategic Command issue a unified directive? Do individual commanders make independent decisions? Does the Federal Reserve maintain its funding prohibition? Does the legislature take additional action? Do Allied governments withhold support? Here are the 3 scenarios. Scenario 1. The executive withdraws the authorization, facing legislative denial, central bank funding refusal, military command division, and Allied hesitation. The executive postpones action pending further diplomatic efforts. This is the de-escalation scenario. Scenario 2. The strike proceeds with partial military compliance. Some commanders execute the operation, others refuse. The attack occurs but is fragmented and incomplete. Constitutional crisis deepens as the legislature moves toward impeachment, and courts are forced to rule on whether commanders who participated acted lawfully. This is the fracture scenario. Scenario 3, the military refuses the order entirely. The Joint Strategic Command determines that executing strikes explicitly denied by the legislature violates constitutional war powers and no units participate. The executive's authority is challenged and the constitutional system holds, but at the cost of a breakdown in executive military trust. This is the institutional preservation scenario. The federal Constitution has governed this nation for 147 years. Article 7's war powers provisions have been invoked during 5 major conflicts. In every previous case, the executive sought and received legislative authorization before initiating major military operations. If this operation proceeds, it will be the first time an executive has ordered offensive military action after the legislature explicitly denied authorization. What I know for certain right now, at 11:47 p.m., the executive signed a strike authorization at 11:58 p.m. The legislature denied approval at 12:03 a.m. The military received conflicting directives at 2:14 a.m. The Federal Reserve refused funding at 4:29 a.m. The Joint Strategic Command placed constitutional judgment on individual commanders. The operational window opens at dawn. The executive has ordered military action. The legislature has denied authorization. Military commanders are divided, and the Constitution provides no clear resolution mechanism. The question is not whether the Northern Federation's missile installations pose a strategic threat. The question is whether the constitutional system includes a mechanism for constraining executive war powers when the legislature explicitly denies authorization. At 6:47 a.m., the Federal Archives recorded the following entry: executive strike authorization issued, legislative denial recorded, military compliance status pending, constitutional war powers doctrine unresolved. And whether the next entry records a strike launched or an authorization withdrawn will determine whether Article 7's separation of war powers survived its first direct test.